Hey everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of our alphabetical taboo busting journey. Today is T for trauma and triggers. That's right, it's a double T day today. And we're going to talk about this for many reasons, not just because it is a taboo, another T word we could have used, although it might have been a bit too general, but also because right now a lot of people are not only experiencing traumatic times, but are experiencing a lot of things that trigger past trauma that has followed us around throughout our lives. But in order not to trigger any FOMO in my lovely co-host, I'll invite Sylvia back into the show after this brief little monologue of mine. So Sylvia, welcome. Glad to have you as always.
Good to see you, my friend, and always great to be here to have tantalizing and thoughtful discussions.
Loving that alliteration. We've obviously talked about this before between ourselves, and throughout the series, we've touched upon a lot of connected topics. And for me, I think one of the things that I'd love to touch upon that you actually mentioned just before we started recording is the idea that often we don't know what other people's trauma is. And even if we do know, there's a lot of, I guess, hidden stuff behind the scenes that can explain so much of people's behaviors. And I know that I've experienced it with myself and with others that we often see different things trigger different behaviors, and it can be difficult to understand if we don't know what lies behind it. And
Mhm.
as an example, and I know you've got some similar stories of your own, but I guess to launch into it, like for me, I from a workplace perspective had a boss years ago who he sort of got off on messing with people's heads. For him, it was this idea that it was testing loyalty, it was testing people's fortitude and mental strength and everything. But in reality, it fostered an environment of paranoia and distrust. And for such a long time, it sort of stayed in the back of my mind where anytime I'd be asked to do something or I'd be given a project or something where was brought up, there was like that little part of me that wondered, is this real? Is this a test? Is this something that they're then going to say, oh, we were actually hoping you'd take this in a different direction against our instructions or something.
Mhm.
And even though that didn't like lead me down a bad path or anything, the fact that it's stuck in there shows that trauma isn't just these huge life-changing events that happen to us. It is stuff that we carry around with us that leaves that little mental scar
Mhm.
that, unless we deal with it, continues to somehow affect our well-being and behavior.
100%. I mean, gosh, your story is so poignant on so many levels for me, because I have experienced these, mental games that people play, and I'm just, such a proponent of the opposite of that. So more on that in just a second. Yet, I do want to score 1 out of 3 things right now in response to what you just so nicely and openly shared. One is, you're right. I mean, the trauma that you and I have talked about as friends between ourselves, and the trauma that we will definitely talk about today, includes those unseeable scars, right? So physical trauma um, is more easily spotted, obviously, right? So if someone literally had a gashing wound, if someone were literally missing a chunk of their skin, that is physically trauma, right? There is a trauma unit at the hospital for that reason. And our brains can register that this person is hurt, right? This person needs attention and care, to minimize the pain and the impacts of that trauma. Yet many of us fortunately work in environments that don't require physical risk, but the emotional trauma is huge, right? Rampant, frequent, in magnitudes of all kinds. Yet we don't see it, and we often also, I think, dismiss the possibility of trauma emotionally speaking, right? So those emotional scars that you talk about, very few of us in the office setting anyway go around showing those scars, right? There's no physical way to do it, obviously, because it's in here and here. Yet so many of us have those scars. And I think one of the reasons why I was excited to talk about trauma as a taboo subject in our series is because some of that trauma is not even welcomed as a subject of conversation in corporate, right? In the office setting. It's like, I remember I told somebody that something my manager had said and done, and I'll get into that in a second, as to serve point number two up. Something that this person said to me really stung me. And the response was, well, and I've told you the story before, you have 10 minutes to get over it. I'm going to set the timer now. You have 10 minutes to get over it. Be a big girl, suck it up, fucking move on. Right. And I was like bewildered. I was like, seriously? Like, if somebody came into the trauma unit in the hospital with like a giant gaping wound, like, are you going to be like, okay, dude, you got 10 minutes to get well, put some shit on it and get the fuck out of here? Like, right? It's like, you would not do that.
You have 10 minutes to stop bleeding. Suck
Right?
it in.
Suck it in. Just, yeah, like, get it together, man. And that was the beginning of me learning, like you said, some of these bad patterns of shoving things down, right? Tucking it away, not dealing, not talking about it, not asking for help. Because I learned from that moment on that, at least in that environment, you're not, it's not okay to be not okay, right? You got to be okay, and that's the only acceptable condition to be in. So before I talk about my second point, I love to pause here and get your reaction.
Yeah, no, and it's very true that I think it's not always a welcome subject, and I think because we learn that we shouldn't talk about it, we carry it with us, and it starts affecting relationships where that isn't a problem.
Yes.
And on a personal level, I have issue or I've dealt with issues in terms of personal relationships within my family where they've affected, without me realizing, a lot of my interactions throughout my, especially childhood and teenage years. Where looking back, I go, oh, I understand why I acted like that. But at the time, it was this unspoken trauma that I hadn't dealt with, I hadn't recognized. And if we move back into that workplace scenario, it's so easy to be in a workplace where things are like that and you learn it's not something you talk about, it's just something you expect. So you go to a new place and you just expect and maybe even accept poor behavior. But even if the poor behavior isn't there, you're almost waiting for it. You're expecting it because you think, yeah, that's what happens at places. And that's where it's so subtle because it's not about experiencing bad stuff over and over and I guess reacting massively to it. It's at that point where you just kind of shrug and go, that's just the way stuff is.
Oh yeah. I mean, that unresolved trauma unfortunately does resurface. As I learned this week, I had something come back up 10 years later because I was taught, right, that, okay, right, it just is, right? Everybody deals with it, right? Like, you're not any more special. Don't be a snowflake. And even, right, so essentially what happened was 10 years ago, I confided in a leader, and that leader betrayed my trust, right? And then it caused all kinds of things that really weren't good for anybody, but especially me, right? And in the end, we all end up on our 2 feet. Everybody was fine. It was probably the best thing that could have happened to me, career-wise. It really did, like, put me on a path that, looking back, was really much more, I think, fitting. But the uncertainty, right, the anxiety I had, or like me feeling betrayed and discarded, and all those feelings. I mean, I just put it away because I just thought, well, that's what management
Mm.
does. That's what, right? That, right? If you want to be a corporate citizen, you got to just take it, right? And so I didn't deal with it, even though it left an impression on me. And I had promised myself after that point that I would never treat anybody like discarded or, or just easily replaceable things, right? That if someone confided in me, if someone trusted me, I'm going to honor that trust. I am going to honor that confidence. I'm going to do what I can to support reasonably, right, this person. And in this case, it wasn't even anything that negative. But long story short, I had a situation just this week where I confided in somebody, and they betrayed that trust, then used it against me, and I shut down for a day and a half, like literally catatonic, because right, this thing happened 10 years ago, and I just let it be, right? I shoved it down, I put it away, and I even as I was feeling the pain of that betrayal and feeling like I was just, right, discarded trash, like, right, to this person, I even told myself, right, those internal narratives of like, be a big girl, Sylvia, suck it up. You have 10 minutes to bleed, and you better stop, right? And I mean, how screwed up is that, right? Like, even in the moment of me feeling the hurt and pain all over again, I try to shove it back down. And this time, though, I did tell myself, okay, maybe I'll give myself 20 minutes. So, but it turned into about a day and a half of like me just recognizing that was really painful. And the person had, her whole thing was, I don't see what the big deal is. Well, not to condone what she did, or and not to place blame either. I mean, she wouldn't have, because I didn't talk about it, right? So that, which leads us to the next point about this whole idea of, how can we be more empathetic, or how can we show compassion, especially at a time like today when there's so much probably unspoken trauma, unseen trauma that people are either undergoing in the moment or have recently gone through, or right, some triggering event that brought back up these old unresolved traumas. So I'm going to pause for just a second, just to kind of have us noodle on everything that was just shared.
Yeah, I think, even though, and I don't want to downplay any of the trauma people are going through right now,
Mm-hmm.
but probably from my perspective, the most interesting and most potentially, I guess, life-changing, maybe in a good way, um, is, I think, the fact that for a lot of people, those triggers now came in a time where a lot of people are, even if they're still working, they might be working remotely, they might be spending more time with family or more time on their own even. And I've read a few different articles about people that have dealt with things that have been sort of underlying for years because they've suddenly had to.
Mm-hmm.
I read this great article about people that sort of looked more critically at their own alcohol consumption, as an example, when suddenly they were drinking alone on their couch instead of out with friends, and they thought, oh, I'm not drinking more, I'm just noticing it because it's filling up my recycling bin.
Yep.
But and I'm again, I'm not trying to I guess, belittle the work that people are doing. Actually, but I do want to look at I guess, a bright side of it, where it's the fact that we're now, a lot of us, experiencing past trauma that's come up not because of this pandemic, but maybe been triggered by certain elements of it. It means that we're taking a step forward. And I saw this great phrase. My wife sent me like a screenshot of a social media post where someone said, falling into past habits isn't a sign of weakness because it means that they are past. Like, you're recognizing a change in
Yeah.
pattern,
Yes.
and you notice that you relapsed back to an old one. And that's what triggers can do to you. They can make you go back into those bad, trauma-filled behaviors. But until you recognize, and again, to hit on a common theme, until you recognize those patterns, until you recognize the trauma, you won't be able to move away from it. And that's what I've found when, similar to what you said about falling into the, be a big girl, move on, 10 minutes to stop bleeding. It's about recognizing that that's not the way forward, realizing that if you're struggling with something, just telling yourself not to struggle or belittling yourself by being like, oh, how weak am I for struggling with this, but rather wonder, why is it such a
Mhm.
struggle? What's stopping me from moving forward?
Mhm.
And again, sort of to mirror the self-talk episode of last week, not talking about it as if, oh, why can't I move forward from this, but rather logically, what is stopping me from moving forward and how can I work through it?
Yeah.
That's something that can be really difficult to do alone.
Mhm.
So finding someone you can open up to about it, whether a professional or someone close to you that you can trust, it can really help you untangle some of the things that have been often lingering just beneath the surface
Mhm.
for, as you pointed out, often years or decades.
Yeah. Yeah. I love this notion that we now have, I think, more opportunities to look at these past traumas, right? And I agree with you, right? Not to belittle or minimize the impact and pain and hurt. Yet, I'll say, right, in my own case this week, right? In the past, let's say if this betrayal had happened 7 months ago, pre COVID, I likely would have distracted myself, right? There were plenty of means to distract myself, right? I could have gone out with friends. I could have, even easier access to all kinds of wine if that was going to be my method of coping. I could have done other things, tantalizing things, right? To just sort of, band-aid over the pain, which is what I did. What I used to do, right? I would just go, oh well, like I feel really hurt, so I'm gonna go and fly a plane, literally. Like that was my escape. Right? I'm gonna get behind the cockpit and go do that thing, right? And yet that was just temporary. That I never dealt with, like the hurt of the betrayal, right? The breach of confidence, right? That this feeling that I didn't matter. But like now, right, this week, it's like, whoa, my options were pretty limited. It was like, well, I could either sulk in the master bathroom or the guest bedroom. Right? So it's like, what are my options? Right. But it forced me, and not to make light of, again, anybody dealing with very emotional distress, very highly, distressing events. For me, it did force me to look at these things. And I'm really grateful that in the 10 years since that kind of hurt really cut me deeply, I have built new tools, found new methods and people and ways to learn to have even that dialogue with myself, right? To kind of like, give myself the grace to heal, give myself the time to heal, to say what it is, recognize it for what it is, and then really start to paint, right, a contrast state of like, okay, like now going forward, right, how do I deal with this person, and what's the outcome, right? So I couldn't agree more. And again, I just want to say, if anybody is feeling the weight of that emotional distress in such a way that you cannot cope on your own, or you feel like it's just too much, please ask for help. There's no shame in that. um and there's no such thing as my trauma is too small for
Mm.
people to care. There's no such thing there. I just really want to put that out there.
And I think that's such a valuable thing to think about because um, it's funny. I remember when I spoke to a therapist for the first time, and she said something about how often people would come to her, and the first thing they'd say would be something like, "Oh, my case must be the most traumatic or most awful thing you've ever dealt with." And I remember being like, "Oh, wow." I would have expected it to be the other way around because I've known so many people that have been like, "Oh, my depression isn't that bad. I still get up in the morning. I still go to work. It can't be that bad. I can't need help." But in reality, that's like saying, "Oh, I won't seek medical help unless it's terminal."
Right.
You need to take care of, like, if you spot a problem when it's small, fix it while it's small.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and I think, before we sort of start wrapping up, there's this idea that I heard of a while back in terms of, um, I guess, the feelings of whether it's trauma, depression, whatever, which really helped me as someone who was often told and as many were, you know, don't feel bad about your situation. You know, there are starving children there. There's this happening there. Um, but in reality, it's relative. You know, it's really hard to thrive when you're struggling to survive, and that struggle can come in so many different forms. And from my perspective, as an example, I was one of those people who said for the longest time, you know, my problems can't be that bad because, you know, I still get up, I still go to work, etc., etc. But in reality, even though it wasn't stopping me from literally surviving, it was stopping me from thriving
Hmm.
because I still did stuff, but I didn't enjoy it as much, and it cost me extra stress, extra difficulties. And when I look back, yeah, I got through stuff,
Hmm.
but wouldn't it have been better if I wouldn't have just gotten through it, if I would have been able to expand upon that, enjoy it? So definitely, no matter how big or small the issue is, talk to someone, find that help that you need, because that's all we can do, right? We can make the most out of what we have. And especially, you know, with life so full of, to start heading towards next week, with life being so full of uncertainty in general, but especially now when we don't know what's coming up next, we don't know for how long
Hmm.
current measures are going to be. You know, like I'm speaking to friends that are still back in the UK, and they don't know what's going on. Numbers are going up, lockdowns are being proposed. Uncertainty is something that's difficult to deal with, and that is part of what's triggering trauma for a lot of people, because people tend to fill in the blanks of uncertainty with the worst case scenario.
Hmm.
And I'm really interested in talking about that next week, partially because of its timeliness, but also because a lot of the stuff we've talked about on the show, we've touched upon it and said, oh, you know, I used to struggle with this a lot, but I've worked through it, sometimes go back to it, whatever. But I'll fully admit, uncertainty is something I still struggle massively with. I still, like, I'll try to tell myself, oh, you know, I can't affect it, I don't know, but that's surface level. I struggle with the idea of uncertainty, and it's a really interesting topic from a lot of different points of view, but I'll leave that till next week. But I can't wait to deep dive into that topic.
Likewise, I'm looking forward to the uncertainty of co-creating.